Hello, everyone. Welcome to BayICT Tech Talks. I'm Olivia Hereford, and really excited to have with us today Atif Haque, who is a leader in LinkedIn's information security organization, and really want to thank him for joining us today, which will be our last Tech Talk for the spring 21 semester. We will resume for summer session June 14th, I believe. So again, thank you so much for joining us, Atif. We really appreciate your time. I'll hand it over to you.
Great, awesome. Thank you, Olivia, for this opportunity. So a little bit about myself. I'm a manager in the security organization at LinkedIn. I've worked in various security roles for the past 14 years, primarily focusing in the GRC space, which stands for governance, risk, and compliance. Today, I currently lead the vendor security program, which is really the topic we're discussing today. I also wanted to share a fun fact about myself. I thought it would be interesting, kind of start off with a fun fact. I started off my career in accounting. I was actually a financial auditor very early in my professional life, and also have a master's in accounting. But as I had started my career in accounting, I got pulled in a few security projects by luck. And ever since then, I just never looked back and wanted to continue focusing on security. So fast forward 14 years after, still doing security projects and very happy and excited being in this space. So with that said, I'll jump straight into the agenda. So I'll talk a little bit about just understanding risk management, just giving you a quick overview on what risk management is, and then dive into a little bit around the trends I'm seeing in vendor risk today. And then we'll get into around talking about the vendor lifecycle. You know, it's critical that for any individual that's working on vendor security should have a good overview of the various life cycle when it comes to onboarding or even initiating requests with vendors. So I'll walk through that, and then the key part of the slide deck or the talk today will be focused on how do you conduct an effective vendor assessment. And then I have some example reports and metrics that will be beneficial as you start building your vendor security program. How do you go about sharing some reports and metrics to your leadership team, your management team, to give them more awareness about your program? And then I have a case study. We'll spend probably 10 to 15 minutes going through the case study, and we'll leave time for Q&A as well. Great. So understanding risk management. Risk management is broken up into 4 parts. It starts off with identification, and the thought process of identification is really, it's really to identify the potential risk through various means. And various means in this context means you could go through some level of vulnerability assessment, internal, external threats, and the whole idea is just really you want to identify where risks are within the organization. The second part is more on assessment. Once you identify your risk, the next step is focusing on determining the impact and likelihood of that risk. Like how critical is that risk to the organization, and do you really need to focus your resources in mitigating that risk down to a level of that's acceptable to the organization. Some organizations take approaches where they would categorize their risk into different buckets: high, medium, low. And like in the case of even here at LinkedIn today, we prioritize all of our efforts on any risk that's classified as high or medium. In some cases, low risk would be accepted depending on the type of risk. So, and it really depends on the type of organization or the industry you're part of. Every organization takes a different approach, but that's one way of assessing your risk. The third step here is focusing on response and remediation. That's all about how do you respond to that risk? How do you ensure that you're taking those steps to mitigate that risk down to an acceptable level? And then finally, we have monitoring, which I think it's key here. And if you can look at the slide here, it's a loop. The idea is you want to ensure that any risks that have been identified, assessed, and mitigated or remediated, does not reoccur again. That's kind of the point of the monitoring. And then also the other point here is to ensure that you're continuously monitoring risk within your organization. So jumping on into vendor security risk and how this relates to the organizational risk management. So here's a definition. I'll read through it a little bit and then provide a quick overview from my perspective on what vendor risk really means. So vendor security risk management is part of an organization's risk management framework that is used to identify, analyze, monitor, and where necessary, mitigate security risks vendors might pose. Such risk could affect your business cybersecurity, regulatory compliance, business continuity, as well as organizational reputation. So the idea of vendor risk is when organization engage third-party vendors to perform some type of service, or if they're going to purchase an application from these vendors, what's happening in that case, you're expanding your risk beyond your organizations. Now it's getting expanded to a third party. And that is why today organizations take quite a bit of investment into building vendor security programs to ensure that they are addressing the risk that third-party vendors may pose to their organization. So it could, and also it's driven by regulatory needs. It could be compliance needs. It could also be other reasons why you want to ensure that your vendors are doing what it takes to protect your information when they're providing a service to you. A little bit about the trend that I'm seeing. So first of all, there's been an increased number of data breaches. I think if you even just simply do a Google search online, you will see a number of data breaches have gone up over time. I have some sources here on the slide, which folks can refer at the end of this call. But what I found as part of a simple research was 80% of breaches involves personal data. What that means is 80% of breaches involves people's personal information, such as their first name, last name, email address, could even include their home address, social security number, and so on, and many more. Average cost of data breach is $4 million, which may not be a significant amount of money for a large organization like Microsoft or Salesforce, but for a small size organization, $4 million could be a lot of money, substantial, and that's just the average number. The other item we saw was average time to identify data breach is around 280 days, which is quite a lot. That means there needs to be a lot more investment in identifying and responding to this risk timely. I also wanted to share an example of a data breach that occurred a few years ago, which was obviously all over the news related to target breach. It happened in 2013 and also related to a vendor. In the case of the target breach, 60 million target customers were impacted by it. What had happened was the cyber attackers that had gained access through stolen credentials of the vendor organization. And the vendor organization, in this case that got compromised, was involved in Target's heating and air conditioning system. So imagine a heating and air conditioning system through a third party that provided heating and air conditioning system services, the hackers were able to gain access into Target systems. So they were able to compromise credentials from this heating system, and the attackers had accessed Target systems using the vendor's compromised credentials, and were able to pivot into other systems within Target stores. One of the systems that they did definitely target were the point of sale systems, the credit card systems that you see today. So, you know, pretty significant and very sophisticated attack through a third-party vendor. You know, they had stolen anywhere from like your name, email, payment card numbers, credit card verification codes, and so on. And there's a lot more data that were compromised. But that just shows that a simple third-party vendor, such as a heating and air conditioning vendor providing that type of service to an organization, can introduce a significant risk to the organization, and more reason why we need to focus on vendor security. The second trend that I'm seeing is increased regulatory scrutiny. We are starting to see regulations being introduced, such as the Gdpr, General Data Protection Regulation, which is very much focused on EU data. So if you're an organization that processes European Union's data, you need to comply with this law. So we're starting to see a lot of focus around ensuring that third-party vendors are aligning with this regulation. And in the case of GDPR, you also need to ensure you have a specific agreement in place, a data processing agreement, in order to share data with these third parties. Other laws such as HIPAA, which has been around for many years, also has very specific requirements on third parties as well. And we are going to start seeing a lot more coming in the future. There's a lot already in the process, but there's also a lot of privacy laws around how do you ensure your third parties are protecting data as needed. And then the third piece here is around the continuous reliance on vendors. We are seeing increased number of vendor reliance over the past several years. Even at LinkedIn, from the time I started, we have seen over 200% of increased numbers of vendors. So that's quite a bit of number. And then the other point here is only 40% of organizations have a mature vendor risk management program, which is unfortunately it's concerning, and another reason why we need to invest further in building vendor security programs. So here's the life cycle that I was mentioning earlier. I do feel that in order to build a successful vendor security program, it's critical to understand the life cycle, and also it's important that as an individual running a vendor security program, he or she needs to have some level of visibility or oversight in each of these phases here. So I'll explain as we go through this. So the first phase is intake, which is all about how does the vendor get, how does the business initiate a request that I need this vendor to perform a service for me. It's critical that if you're running a vendor security program, you understand, okay, like what are the different means of folks initiating requests to engage a vendor, a third party within the organization. We have seen, and I've seen in my previous life, where organizations have had multiple ways of initiating requests with vendors. And in some cases, they don't have clear visibility in terms of how they're being initiated and whether they're actually going through the right level of due diligence. The second step is where, in majority cases, you would have the security team involved in perform a due diligence. It's a level of assessment, which we'll get more into in details on the later slides. But the idea here is that you want to conduct an assessment on that vendor. You want to make sure the vendor does meet your standards, your requirements. If they're processing a lot of data, if they're storing like first name, last name, email, a lot of personal data, you want to make sure that they are aligned with your standards. So that's all about security due diligence. And then the third phase is contracting. This is where you're establishing contract terms with the vendor. It's important that security is also involved here. I spend roughly 30 to 40% of my time just on contracting, especially when we're negotiating contracts, security terms with our vendors. And also you want to make sure that as you perform an assessment of vendors and you have very specific requirements, in some cases you want those requirements to be called out on the contract. So you hold them accountable. You hold the vendor accountable that they're going to meet those requirements from a contractual standpoint. And then, the fourth phase here is all about onboarding. This is the time when the vendor gets onboarded. It's also important here that security has some level of oversight as the vendor is onboarded, and you want to ensure that what got approved as part of the security due diligence process is how you engaged the vendor. I've seen cases where the security team will perform an assessment on application A, and they will perform due diligence, they'll have specific requirements, and they will work with the business on how to onboard application A. However, in certain cases, we'll see that the business decides to go and onboard application B instead. So that's why more reason to have some level of oversight on the onboarding process. And then the next phase here is continuous monitoring. I have another slide that goes more in depth here, but continuous monitoring is important, tying back to the risk management framework. You want to continuously monitor your vendors to ensure that they are meeting your standards, your requirements, and confirm that if anything has changed in the vendor's environment, you do have some level of understanding of what changed and how does that impact you as the organization. And then finally, termination. A lot of people ask me, why is termination important? It's important because this is the point when the vendor contract ends, and you want to ensure that either the vendor deletes all your data, purges all the information that they've captured on your behalf, or also if they have access. We see from time to time, we see a lot of managed service providers. These are consulting firms that have direct access to your environment or your systems. You want to make sure that access is terminated when the contract ends, or if the services ends, you want to ensure those steps have been taking place. So another reason why security needs to be involved in the vendor lifecycle. So the next couple of slides will get into more around conducting vendor assessments. So step one, which is all about identifying vendors and really identifying the vendor security risk. And the approach here, and this is just an example that I had pulled out here, but the approach here is just to ensure that you are tiering your vendors in some level of categories so that you can better prioritize your efforts. So in this example here, you see the risk tierings are high, medium, low. And the idea here is that for high risk vendors, you definitely want to perform a more thorough due diligence or assessment on that vendor. And what's driving the high risk are the criteria you see on the top. So you see data, service disruption, reputation. So data is all about what type of data are they processing? What data is this vendor storing in their environment? So they're definitely collecting something from your organization and storing it in their environment. In some cases, organizations will classify highly confidential data as data that has maybe social security number, may include people's race, gender information, and so on. That would probably fall under more of the higher confidential type of data. Limited data could be where it's maybe not as sensitive of a data. It could be more focused on maybe they're processing public information that's out in the open. And then service disruption is all about how critical is that service to your organization. So if they're providing a service to you that's super critical, and if, let's say, for some reason that service goes down, does that have a huge impact to your organization? So imagine, let's say, if you're hosting your application on Azure or AWS, and for some reason Azure AWS goes down, that will take your entire application down as well. So that falls under a critical type of service. Reputational is all about it's all about the impact the vendor has to your organization in case they ever encounter some type of data breach. Think about the Target example I talked about earlier. Obviously, even though it was a vendor that provided an air conditioning, heating service, had a huge reputational impact to Target for multiple years. I think some people are still talking about it today, and also had a lot of impact that resulted from it. So just these are criteria as an example. Every organization take a different approach on building their criteria on how they want to classify vendor risk between high, medium, low. I've seen organizations take an approach of a 5 risk tiering approach, or in some cases, we're also seeing 3 tiering. So it really depends on your risk framework or methodology. So the step 2 here is mainly focusing on conducting the assessment. So now that you understand the tiering, risk classification between high, medium, and low, the next step is, okay, what type of assessment you want to perform on that vendor? This is a very simple example. So the few options that you have, and every organization takes a different approach, but in this example here, we have security questionnaires, and the thought process behind it is you're sending a questionnaire out, a set of questions out to your vendors to understand a little bit more about a security program and posture. So like in the case of LinkedIn, we would ask questions around like, okay, do you have security policies in place? Do you encrypt our data at rest? If it's a cloud SaaS provider, tell us more about your retention policy and so on. So you would obviously go through a various set of security domains, ask a set of questions, and then based on the responses, then you'll perform a review on does that align with your requirements and standards. A lot of organizations use other authoritative standards out there, like the NIST 853 standard, which is well known. There's also the ISO 27001 standard, which organizations build their questionnaire out of. There's also the Cloud Security Alliance, also has a very well-known standard that organizations use for conducting assessments on vendors. And then the other piece that I added here was around reviewing third-party certification. So what are third-party certifications? So these are reports that are produced by a third-party. Think of them as a third-party auditing firm, like the Big Four, like E&Y, PwC. They usually go out. They'll conduct an audit on these organizations, and they will produce a report. And usually they will attest, they'll provide their opinion that they meet certain standards. They'll go through a list of security controls. They'll identify, obviously the audit will cover a specific scope, and they'll go through a bunch of security controls and then identify if there's any gaps. Are there any security risk that they found as part of their audit assessment? So a lot of times when we at LinkedIn assess our vendors, we would ask for these third-party certification, like a SOC 2 report or an ISO certification. And we will review those reports. And if there are any gaps identified, then we'll initiate conversations with the vendor to understand what are they doing to address those gaps. So that's really the intent of third party. It's really more of an independent assessment performed by a third-party auditing firm to give you a different perspective on the vendor's security program and posture. And then the third piece here is external pen test. It's all about, and it's really more applicable to SaaS cloud providers. It gives you more comfort in terms of if the vendor's environment is protected from the outset, from some level of external threat. Can you penetrate into an environment and expose information? There's several security firms out there that perform penetration tests or provide that service. And at LinkedIn, we spend quite a bit of time reviewing our vendors' external pen test, especially if they're a cloud provider, to gain comfort on more around their application security side of things. The third step, which I had mentioned a couple of times earlier, is around continuous monitoring. So the thought process here is, once you have conducted an assessment on your vendor, you want to ensure that you're continuously monitoring them as well. And this is also a very simple example around putting your vendors on a type of frequency, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years frequency. And every organization will obviously use their own framework and standard, but the idea here is that if let's say you're a high-risk vendor and you're processing very extremely sensitive data, you probably want to assess that vendor a little bit more frequent than a low-risk vendor. So you may want to put that vendor on a 6 months, 1 year type of frequency. And it could be anywhere from sending them another security questionnaire, reviewing the third-party certifications, or in some cases, you could also perform some level of on-site audit. If it's a significant high-risk vendor, you may deem that it's necessary that we need to conduct an on-site audit or a virtual on-site audit. So that's the idea here, is to perform more of a continuous monitoring. Some of the recent approach organizations have taken is around using tools, automated tools that scans from the outset, scans vendors' environment from the outset, and it produces a report that gives you some level of indication around their security posture. There are several tools out there today in the market that gives you that level of information. So here's just one example that folks can use around continuous monitoring and ensuring that vendors meet your are continuously meeting your standards. Like I said earlier, it's important to have reports and dashboards as part of any vendor security program, depending on if you're using a tool to conduct your assessments, or even if you're using as simple as Excel files. It's good to understand where you see most of the risk within the organization. So in this simple example, which I created using dummy data, you can see here that significant number of low risk vendors versus high and medium, which is probably a good thing. You probably don't want to have a lot of high risk vendors, or if you do, that means you need to probably invest more time and resources on assessing high-risk vendors. But also you can kind of also see on the report at the bottom of the screen here, the types of vendors like software, more contractors, on-prem, all the types of services they're providing to your organization. It gives you a good perspective around whether you want to make any changes within your program and to ensure that you're addressing risk. So just as an example for folks to see. All right, I'll move on to the next slide here. So here's the case study. I think we'll just give folks probably 5 minutes. Is that okay, Olivia? Probably 5 to 7 minutes for folks to kind of go through this and then go through a few questions.
Yeah, let's take 5 minutes to review and think about it.
Awesome.
Do we need more time? I don't think so. I mean, if I can myself, I can figure it out. So why don't we?
I'll go ahead. And maybe I'll just give a quick overview of the case study here and then jump straight into the question. And we'll hope that folks can have more of an interactive session now. So this case study is it's a very typical type of case study where the business here, so you're part of a security organization, ABC Corporation, and responsible for vendor security due diligence, and your head of HR comes to you and wants to purchase an applicant tracking system. So really to manage recruiting lifecycle, which includes job requisitions, approval, routing, candidate application, interview feedback, and so on. So the business wants to purchase this application. Now that they're kind of going through the security due diligence process, they want to ensure that it meets all of your requirements and standards. And then on the case study, as you can see here, during the session of the meeting with the head of HR, it was very clear that this is a top priority. And yeah, as a ATS, an applicant tracking system, a big priority for your head of HR. And then also you will notice in the bullet points here, what type of data is this ATS system going to be processing? So there's candidate information. So these are people like applicants that are applying for jobs, capturing first name, last name, email. There's also social security numbers, gender information, race, and so on. And then job information, job title, description, location, as well as the hiring manager's information. Now, so obviously a few questions comes in mind as you would perform any type of vendor assessment here. First of all, what risk tier is this application? So based on, and I'll go back here to the slide. So based on the tiering, if we use this example that I shared, obviously this may change depending on what organization or what industry you're in. But if we use this framework, what do you feel the risk tier of this vendor would fall, and why? Anyone wants to take a first stab at this?
And since we're a small group, everybody just unmute and speak up and ask questions. We don't have to use chat.
I could take a guess at it, but I might have done this once or twice in the past. We're hoping.
Go for it.
Well, I haven't. So I'll take a guess. It's very high risk for data because you're collecting a lot of personal information.
Yep. Exactly. In fact, I was just looking at the chat as well as you were talking here. So yes, it is definitely extremely high risk because if you look at the case study or the example scenario here, there's social security number, there's gender, race, ethnicity, a lot of sensitive information is being captured. So as based on that framework, you would definitely want to deem this vendor as high risk and ensure that you perform a full assessment on this vendor. So with that said, so now that we know we have established this vendor's high risk, what type of assessment, what type of vendor assessment would you think would be sufficient to give you a better understanding of the vendor's securities environment, and to also confirm that okay, they're going to do they do have the sufficient policies, standards, even controls in place to protect your data? So what type of assessment would you want to perform? So I'll move into the slide here, and you could use this as your example.
Well, you're always going to do the questionnaire, right? So your question is, after you got that information, then what type of assessment would you do after that?
Yeah, I mean, questionnaire is definitely the first step. And it could be a combination of multiple things where you do a security questionnaire, and then based on the responses, you may have follow-up questions for them. As well as you could leverage some of the third-party certification if they have any third-party certifications in place. So like as mentioned earlier, SOC 2 certification is a standard that gives you some level of comfort on their security posture. You could leverage that, or if they have an ISO certification. Since this is an applicant tracking system, obviously, and I think it's stated in the case area, it's on the cloud, you would probably want to ask them, do they even have a penetration test report that they could share with you? If they don't have one, in some cases, you may want to perform a pen test on your own, or hire a security firm to perform that pen test to ensure that the product is secured, from an application security standpoint. So those are various methods you could take. In some cases, you could even go further if you really feel like this is a significant risk to your organization because of the type of data they're processing. You could even go further and perform some level of on-site virtual audit, depending on how the agreement has been established with the vendor. Yeah. Okay. And then I guess the third question would be more around monitoring. Now that you have performed an assessment, let's assume everything went well. There were no major gaps, no issues. The business have onboarded the vendor successfully, and they're probably used it for a number of months. What type of continuous monitoring plan would you want to put them on? Do we feel like we want to monitor this vendor very frequently because of the type of data they're processing?
Do the answers from the security assessments matter as to choosing your frequency?
So, sorry, say that again.
Do the answers from your security assessments, the questionnaires and the third parties, does that matter on choosing for your continuous monitoring frequency?
It could. Oh yeah, yes, definitely. It could, because in some cases, some of the security assessments, depending also on the level of effort, like for instance, the third-party certifications, a lot of organizations undergo a third-party cert on an annual basis. So, and usually they're valid for 1 year. So you may want to ask them on an annual basis for an updated, revised third-party certifications. The security questionnaire could be could be, you could do it also on an annual basis, or you could even do it at a point if anything changes within the vendor's environment. So you could even leverage the security questionnaire. One of the approaches that we even do here at LinkedIn is we send a much shorter set of questions and ask them if anything has changed in their policies, standards. Have they gone through any data breach as well? And then if any of the questions they answered yes, then we may send them an additional set of questions. So it could definitely vary based on the type of assessment. I'm just looking through the chat and I see some comments here. I see a comment on, do most hiring management systems, resume track system ever use fake honeypot resumes, candidate profiles? So I'm not sure if they do. I think it depends on the applicants that are applying. There's definitely an integration where when you do apply for a job, it does ingest the resume. So it depends on what you upload. But if, let's say, you're trying to upload some sort of malicious file, a lot of the systems today does track for or scan for any malicious software being uploaded. In fact, we do that today even at LinkedIn, within the LinkedIn platform. If you're chatting with someone using the Messenger app on LinkedIn and you upload a file, it gets scanned for malicious software. So a lot of ATS systems also do that today. And that was something that you would want to check for as part of your vendor assessment, is does it check for any malicious software being uploaded?
There's a question about, would you hire an independent consultant to do the evaluation?
That's a great question. Yes, you could definitely do. There are several folks in my team that are independent contractors, consultants that perform assessments for me. You definitely can, and in fact, even in my prior life, we have leveraged consultants to perform a lot of the on-site virtual type of audits on your vendors. It's definitely a solution. Again, it goes back to your organization's approach on how they want to build the vendor security program, whether they want to rely on consultants versus FTEs. But yes, you could definitely leverage independent consultants to evaluate vendors from time to time. Great question. I guess one last question, and then I definitely want to open it up for any Q&A. Let's assume that the head of HR, as stated in the case there, the head of HR wants to onboard this applicant ATS system in 2 weeks. And we see this from time to time where the business will come to you and saying that we want this now, we want it right away, and it could be a very high risk type of use case. How do you respond to a head of HR type of individual? How would you address their ask to perform an assessment in 2 weeks period, assuming that you have a lot of other assessments that you have to perform on vendors, a lot of other high priorities? How would you respond to a head of HR like that? It's a very typical scenario that we face on a daily basis. So just curious to know, like, how folks will respond to that. So, and I can quickly jump in here. I think one of the approaches that we have taken is there's always an opportunity to perform a quick high-level assessment. One of the things that we have done as well is we've built standards, minimum requirements, and usually in some cases we help the business take some level of accountability. Like, look, here's some requirements. Have them validate with the vendors whether they do meet these requirements. That way they're doing some of the work for you, and also at the same time you're helping them understand a little bit more about risks within the organization. It does require a little bit more work because you may need to require some training for them. and have them understand some of the basics stuff. So that's one approach, folks, that can be taken. Another approach is where you establish SLAs. You make it very clear that here's our defined SLAs based on all the requests that we have. So just like running another service organization, where you communicate upfront for a high risk type of use case or service, it's going to take us X number of weeks to get done. So we do that very frequently with our business to set expectations early in the process, so that there's no surprises. So that's another approach.
So as you were saying earlier, being involved as early as possible in the intake process, right? Where
Correct.
the as part of the RFP or the proposal and all of those SLAs and requirements are, a lot of that is covered before you're even making a decision, right?
Yes, it's critical to be involved early, because at the end of the day, as any as security individuals, we don't want to be the blocker for the business. We do want to enable them to be successful. So as early as we get involved in the process, as you're even thinking about onboarding a specific type of vendor, the better it is. That way, one of the things that I've done within my team is help provide guidance to the business around, here are requirements, here are the specific security requirements that we would expect from a certain type of vendor providing, depending on what service they're going to be providing to us, so that there's no surprises. We have also created like minimum requirements, baseline standards, and shared that with our business teams. Also shared that with like our sourcing partners, legal teams, so everyone's made aware. And it helps. It does help set expectation early in the process, and also prevents any surprises later as you perform the assessments on the vendors. Great. I will open it up for any Q&A, any questions. And I think I see a question on the chat. So there's a question here around what about corporate exit strategy, vendor contracts, account, access termination, migration to new vendors? So if I understand your question correctly, in terms of termination, you definitely want to have visibility as a security team. You want to make sure you want to make sure that you definitely understand when the vendor is getting terminated. Even though when vendors do get terminated, it may be tracked in a whole separate system. Might not necessarily be part of the system that you're using to perform or conduct vendor assessment. So you definitely want to have some level of visibility around when vendors are getting terminated, so that you can take the right relevant steps to ensure that they're properly being terminated. Even as you're migrating to new vendors, you definitely want to have some level of visibility in terms of what that new vendor is going to be, and so you can help the business guide them through that process, and also start setting expectation early in the process on security requirements. So definitely an important area to be focused in.
What do you do for triaging against like the heavy workload? Because every company always buys way more products than you could ever possibly do this level of scrutiny on. So how do you do the triage on that? Yeah,
so we use ServiceNow at LinkedIn, and we have the tool do some of the automatic triaging for us automatically based on the type of data being processed by the vendor, or even the use case of service being provided. That helps us reduce the number of tickets that we will need to look in, and where I would actually need a person to assess and perform a due diligence. Because a lot of the use cases we see that come through our review are in most cases lower risk, and we just have the tool do the triage, and then it automatically gets pushed forward. In addition to that, we also help train our sourcing organization, because they're the one directly engaging with the business and understanding, establishing the contract terms and so on. and they know when to engage us. So we have spent quite a bit of time with sourcing and helping them get up to speed on what type of to better understand our risk methodology, our risk framework, and also when to engage us. Yeah. There's another question here on the chat around how often do you get approached by a security product salesperson, and when do you and how can you tell that if their product is good or bad? Yeah, so if it's a security related product, in terms of how often do I get approached, very frequently. That happens quite often. I think it's there's a couple of things. One is definitely if you do see a interesting product or interesting type of service, you definitely want to have a conversation to kind of understand better whether that product meets your needs. There's a lot of startup organizations out there that are focusing in security, even in vendor security space, and they provide, in some cases, what I've seen is the features they provide may address a very specific type of use case for you. So the approach I've taken is I've always gone in conversations with these individuals, understand more about the product, and see whether it fits our needs, and whether it also has the ability to integrate with the systems that we use today as well. That's the other approach I take on evaluating such products. I hope that answers your question. Great. The other question I have here is, do you have any case studies where someone was trying to onboard some kind of data science machine learning tool and it had issues? Are there things you do differently to access security flaws in machine learning systems? So that's a good question. I cannot think of any example right now where we have folks trying to onboard in machine learning tools. I know we do get involved in a lot of like bots where folks are trying to use like automation anywhere to run some sort of to automate a manual process step. And we definitely get involved in reviewing the bot and understanding how the bot would operate and what level of integrations the bot would have. In terms of machine learning, I have not come across that recently, but definitely that's a good question. Yeah.
Atif, back to your risk assessment table.
Yep.
A question came up for me during the case study, and that is, yeah, that one. If let's say, for instance, in this case, data was the really high risk issue, but maybe because it's an HR environment, the service disruption as far as the overall business may not be as critical. Does high risk in any category outweigh? I see data is going to definitely always outweigh any of the others, correct? Yeah,
no, great question. The one way to address that is one of the approaches you could actually take here is you could take a weighted approach where each of these criteria here may have a certain type of weight. You could say that data is substantially important to your organization and you could give it a higher weight. Like I've seen in the past where folks may say data will be 50% of the weight versus service disruption and reputation could be roughly around 25% each. But what we do at LinkedIn is we definitely emphasize a lot more on the data. What data is the vendor processing versus the other criteria that you see here. So that's one approach you could take. The other approach you could take is where, to your point, where if data is high risk, but service disruption and reputation is low risk, you could default to the higher risk tier. Again, it goes back to what your risk tolerance is for your vendors and what approach you want to take. Yeah. The other question I see here is around, are the relationships with vendors maintained by individual LinkedIn employees or through a central committee or management? So, that's a great question. So today, the relationships are maintained through individual LinkedIn employees. I have seen other organizations work towards more of a centralized type of model where you have each organization may have like a risk committee, a representative from that organization that really understands risk and has that relationship with vendors. I've seen both models work very well. But to answer your question specifically, it's mainly at LinkedIn, it's more individual focused. But there's definitely some appetite to move towards a more central committee type of framework in the future. Yeah. Great. Awesome.
Yeah, we're pretty close to on time here. That's pretty good.
Great.
Atif, may we, can you provide BayICT with this PowerPoint so that when we share the video, we can also share the PowerPoint?
Definitely. I can send you an email with the PowerPoint attachment.
Particularly because those look to be some very good sources and processes, something to good reference. Thank you.
Great.
NSA should have hired you to assess Boozell and Hamilton.
Great, thanks.
Good. Any other questions? Hey, hi, Krish. You're muted.
Hi, Olivia. Yeah, I was just listening in. Moral support for Atif. That's all.
Great, thanks.
Hey, well, I really appreciate. I'm gonna definitely tap Atif. He has a wonderful team of people that I met with, and I would love to, have some of them come back too. Atif, I really appreciate this. Thank you. Great. So, we've got 2 minutes. Any more questions? Well, very good. I want to thank those of you that were able to attend. You didn't have, I don't want to say that you didn't have finals to study for. You probably do, but thank you for being here. And again, hope to see you, some of you coming back. And if you're taking summer classes, to do come in and join our summer talks that will start June 14th. So again, thank you all for coming. And we'll have the recording and PowerPoint up, probably by end of day tomorrow. So thank you.
Great.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Good,